Proper planning and effective strategy is important. While winging it, or figuring things out as you go, can be effective, this is hopefully not a trait one would consistently find in the commander of a nation's army. In the spring of 1861, there were several ideas on the Union side on how best to wage and win the American Civil War. Today, we'll look at the history of the most prominent of these plans, and attempt to evaluate it. Welcome in everyone, my name is Benson with Civil War Explored, and this is Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan. The birth of Winfield Scott's plan stems from a grand strategy outline he received from General George B. McClellan in late April of 1861, the first of its kind for the Union. This followed the bombardment of Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, and the secession of the U.S. state of Virginia, in response to President Abraham Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to crush the rebellion. McClellan, who at this time was in command of Union forces in Ohio, envisioned an invasion of either Kentucky and Tennessee or Virginia with an army of 80,000 men. Scott was not an enthusiast of either of these plans. He believed the 80,000 McClellan reference would be better suited to move down the Mississippi River in order to split the Confederacy in two. The problem with invading Kentucky in particular, as envisioned in McClellan's plan, is that Kentucky had declared a state of neutrality. This means that they had not yet seceded from the United States, but did not intend to side with the Union either. Kentucky, which would be known as one of the slaveholding border states to remain in the Union alongside Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, was an extremely vital region due to its location, resources, and the presence of the Ohio River along its northern boundary. President Lincoln, who was originally from Kentucky, is quoted as saying in September 1861, "I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game." He argued here that the other border states could not be relied upon to remain in the Union should Kentucky secede. Kentucky would eventually rescind its neutrality in September of 1861 after a Confederate force under Major General Leonidas Polk invaded and occupied the city of Columbus in the state. However, it did remain incredibly divided in sentiment and even had a star on the Confederate flag. Scott's disagreement with an invasion of Virginia followed largely the same lines. He believed that it would alienate Union sentiment in the border states, which, as we've explored here, were vital to the United States. I think he overestimated this perceived Union sentiment in Northern Virginia especially. He also aimed to make the war effort as least destructive or bloodless as possible, which he believed military moves into Virginia would not be. Furthermore, as a proven logistical genius with plenty of experience, Scott believed it would take time to train the tens of thousands of volunteers filling the ranks. Scott did not suspect the war would be as quick as many others did, and he disagreed with the notion that it would be just one glorious ultimate battle. We see this evident in his plan that he formulated in response to General McClellan's, which would become known as the Anaconda Plan. Now, I first think it proper to address who the man was. When people consider who the greatest American military commanders of all time are, you'll get names such as, in no particular order, Washington, Eisenhower, Patton, Grant, MacArthur, or even names like Nimitz or Pershing. I think it would be foolish to not include Winfield Scott's name among these men. In my opinion, Scott is one of the premier military commanders in the entire history of the United States. Old Fuss and Feathers, as he would come to be called, was born in Virginia in 1786. He initially entered the practice of law, but eventually joined the army at age 21 as a captain of light artillery. Following a court-martial for insubordination, Scott served in the War of 1812 along the U.S.-Canadian border. At a towering 6 foot 5 inches tall, he distinguished himself as a soldier and was promoted to brigadier general in 1814. Scott remained in the army following the conflict, and he commanded in the U.S. Indian Wars in the southern United States. He notably presided over the forced migration and, quite frankly, ethnic cleansing of natives during the horrid Trail of Tears by order of the federal government. He became the commanding general of the U.S. Army in 1841 with the rank of Major General, and he entered the Mexican-American War in that role, but not before unsuccessfully running for the nomination of the Whig Party in the presidential elections of 1840 and 1844. During the war, he would lead and shape dozens of men who would go on to command forces on either side of the upcoming Civil War. Scott devised and led an incredible campaign from the coastal city of Veracruz to capture the Mexican capital of Mexico City in 1847, where he took the risky maneuver of abandoning his supply lines and foraging off the land as he approached the capital. I wonder where we'll see something like this later. Scott ran for the Whig Party nomination for president again in 1848 and in 1852, where he finally won it. However, he would lose to his former subordinate in the army, Franklin Pierce, in the general election for president. In 1855, he received a brevet promotion to lieutenant general, a rank last held by George Washington himself. At the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, Winfield Scott was still the commanding general of the army at the ripe young age of 75. By this time, accounts report he weighed over 300 pounds, suffered from gout, vertigo, several other ailments, and was actually unable to even mount a horse. Nonetheless, it seemed his brain was still working just fine, as it was here where he devised his grand strategy to quell the Southern Rebellion. For a grand overview of the Anaconda Plan, we'll survey the two principal modules that come together to form the broader strategy, plus another that is sort of inherent to waging a war on your front doorstep. These two parts are a firm blockade of the southern states in rebellion and a swift military campaign down the Mississippi River. The third aspect is a rigid defense of the United States capital, Washington. President Lincoln had ordered a blockade of the states in rebellion on April 19th, soon after extending it to include the state of Virginia. Scott believed firmness and strength in these three areas of the plan would isolate a disorganized Confederacy. As for the West, Scott proposed a force of at least 12 to 20 steam gunboats, at least 40 steam transports, and 60,000 men to travel swiftly down the Mississippi River from Cairo, Illinois, to the Gulf of Mexico, turning Confederate garrisons along the river as they went, and leaving detachments behind to man them and cover the rear. Additionally, he said Forts Jackson and St. Philip at the mouth of the Mississippi River south of New Orleans ought to be captured and held. After capturing New Orleans, the largest city in the Confederacy and by far the most important port, Scott argued a tight grip on the city in conjunction with the naval blockade would suffocate the Southern Confederacy. If not, Scott then advocated for campaigning deeper into the central regions of the secessionist states. He suggested the effective force for the Mississippi River campaign be composed of the best regulars, new volunteer force, and officer corps had to offer. Furthermore, he believed these soldiers should have at least 4.5 months of campaign-specific training under their belt prior to its initiation. This, in his letter to McClellan, put the timeline for the endeavor to begin at least by early November of 1861, too far in the future for many. McClellan dubbed the strategy the boa constrictor plan, as the ultimate goal of the military moves was to hold federal forces in place after capturing the Mississippi River and essentially constrict the rebellion and bring it to terms of surrender. The Northern press, after the plan was somehow leaked to them, named it after a different snake, the Anaconda. Scott believed that his strategy would not only starve the Confederacy of necessary resources to wage war, but also compel Southerners with Union sympathies to push for reunification. Scott did not believe that secessionist sentiment was as strong as many thought it to be. He thought that the Fire Eaters, or radical secessionists, were a rather small group, but a very loud one. Objectors to the plan considered it to be too passive. Many in the North, including General McClellan, argued for a more swift stroke to crush the rebellion. Scott's belief was that his plan would require some 300,000 effectives total, anticipating at least a third would become casualties, and take 2 full years to compel the Confederacy to surrender. Congress balked at these numbers suggested by Scott, and the length of time he deemed his plan would require. It was simply too much for a United States citizenry that desperately wanted to maintain the work of the founding generation. In reality, as ironic as it may be, it would take far more than what even Scott suggested to achieve this goal. After all, the plan was not adopted as General Scott intended. However, it didn't go away entirely. As the volunteers gathered in Washington during the late spring of 1861, President Lincoln appointed Brigadier General Irvin McDowell to lead the force. General Scott, who as described earlier, was no longer a viable option for a battlefield commander. Now, McDowell did not necessarily impress Scott. Instead, Scott chose to support Army veteran Brigadier General Joseph K. Mansfield for the position. Prior to Mansfield, Scott actually favored one Robert E. Lee, a soldier he was incredibly fond of, but one who had resigned from the Army after the secession of his home state of Virginia in April. At any rate, when the Army moved into Virginia, it suffered a humiliating defeat at the Battle of First Bull Run, or Manassas, on July 21st. While General McDowell drew the brunt of criticism for the disaster at Bull Run, General Scott was not inculpable in the minds of many contemporaries. President Lincoln soon replaced McDowell with General McClellan, who Scott at this time supported. However, the relationship between the two men deteriorated as 1861 continued on, with McClellan privately lambasting Scott in cabinet meetings. McClellan, who was likely influenced by a personal stance that Scott was an obstacle in his ambition for glory, believed the aged commander was, by this point in his life, senile, incompetent, and unable to handle the impressive national emergency that lay before them. General Winfield Scott, who was disgusted and frustrated by the sheer disrespect and had altogether quite simply had enough, submitted his letter of resignation in October and officially retired from the United States Army on November 1st, 1861. Scott had favored Major General Henry W. Halleck to replace him, but even after all the bickering between himself and the young Napoleon, Lincoln appointed McClellan to take his place. General Winfield Scott's illustrious 50-plus year military career was over. What was left for the North, of course, was to win the war. Now, the Anaconda Plan in and of itself was not implemented by the United States in an official capacity. However, the naval blockade from Norfolk, Virginia to the Rio Grande in Mexico, instituted by President Lincoln in April 1861, did remain in place, and intensifying with time. Additionally, New Orleans was captured by a Union naval squadron under Flag Officer David Glasgow Farragut in April 1862, and control of the Mississippi River was firmly in the United States' hands by mid-July 1863. This, of course, following the surrender of the Confederate Army of Mississippi at Vicksburg, Mississippi, and the capture of Port Hudson, Louisiana. What happened next, arguably, extended beyond the scope of Scott's plan. By 1864, the war had changed. United States military leadership, under new commander of all Union armies, Lieutenant General Ulysses Grant, understood that total war, meaning one that drastically reduced the Confederacy's ability to fuel a war effort, was necessary to crush the rebellion. Reminiscent of Scott's plan for the Mississippi River, Federal armies continued the strategy of partitioning Confederate territory. This isolated supply lines and inhibited multiple rebel armies from linking up. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman's famous March to the Sea and Carolinas campaign in 1864 and early 1865 further debilitated the Confederate war effort. Moreover, there was the Shenandoah campaign of 1864. Under Union Major General Phil Sheridan, this largely crippled the deemed breadbasket of the Confederacy, a region crucial to the food supplies of rebel armies. The Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia, fell to Union forces on April 3rd. Soon after, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant on April 9th at Appomattox. So, how do we fairly evaluate the Anaconda Plan? Historians do generally agree that the strategy served as a solid and cohesive foundation for the broader Union strategy. This broad strategy, of course, molded as the war developed. They agree that General Scott was rather predictive in his notion that the strategy would take at least 2 years to fully quell the rebellion, as opposed to his contemporaries that believed it would be a rather short conflict. Of course, the war would require significantly more men and resources than anyone believed at the outset, as the rebellion was determined to establish an independent slaveholding republic. Scott receives praise for identifying the Mississippi River as a vital geographic feature, and one that, after being fully conquered by Union forces in July 1863, severely hindered the Confederate war effort. The importance he stressed upon the blockading of the South has been criticized by some, due to the ability of Confederate blockade runners to break through, and the fact that it took some time to procure enough vessels to fully staff the incredible naval endeavor. I disagree with the former claim. Blockade runners were not very large vessels and could not carry exorbitant amounts of cargo. Although historians debate the topic, it's generally suggested that around 3/4 of the attempts to run the blockade were successful. These smaller blockade runners were capable of transporting smaller arms and munitions, which definitely aided the Confederate war effort, but I'm not convinced that it extended the war by as much as some would argue. Now, this is not to say I don't think it extended the war at all. An additional few 100,000 rifles in rebel hands was certainly helpful to them. I just happen to think that the practice of blockade running was unsustainable for the type of war that the Confederacy had to fight in order to succeed. What's more, the inherent presence of the blockade persuaded vessels who otherwise may have tried to break through to not attempt it at all. Compared to the statistics of the antebellum South, the Confederacy experienced a 90+% drop in cotton exports during the war. Now, this was not all due to the blockade, however. In the early days of the war, the Confederacy had adopted a strategy of withholding cotton exports to France and Britain. This was in an effort to dwindle the supplies necessary for their vast textile industries. This plan of King Cotton completely backfired for the rebellion, as the European powers mentioned procured their cotton from elsewhere, such as from colonies in India or Egypt. Even though the quality of the crop from these places was not as good as the South's, it made do. Along with the previous abolishment of slavery in Britain and France, this significantly hampered the Confederacy's effort for European intervention in the war. Furthermore, European powers had adopted doctrines of neutrality in 1861, which granted belligerent status to the Confederacy. Now, this was something hopefuls in the South thought of as the first step to full recognition. Unfortunately for them, this served to only benefit the Union, as it diminished the legal questions surrounding the North's blockade of what they still legally considered to be their own country. Due to the vastly lowered export numbers and general lack of infrastructure in the South, the Confederacy had a consistent issue with sufficiently supplying their armies, an issue that got worse as the war continued on, as prognosticated in Scott's plan. General Winfield Scott passed away on May 29, 1866, at the age of 79, but not before seeing his country reunified under one flag. During his retirement at West Point in New York State in 1864, Scott finished his 2-volume memoirs. These memoirs are a quality read for anyone interested in this era of history or in the military history of the United States in general. Interestingly, Scott wrote them in the third person, aiding to his prolific ego that he had of himself. Winfield Scott was brilliant. I think he had a spectacular mind to understand what was necessary to wage successful military campaigns and wars. Soldiers had to be trained properly, preparation was key, and he understood that naval superiority was imperative to flexibility and strategy. His Anaconda Plan, although not officially adopted by the United States, was broadly speaking how the Union defeated the Confederacy in the end. I think the credit he receives for the predictive nature of his grand strategy, coming at the end of a substantially notable military career, is merited, as is his place in the upper echelon of commanders in the military history of the United States of America. Thank you to everyone who watched until the end, and especially thank you for all the support on my first video. The exposure and feedback was certainly unanticipated. Admittedly, I'm a busy person, so patience with the sporadic nature of this channel is much appreciated. If you have any thoughts, questions, agreements, or disagreements with today's video, please let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's video and would like to support future content on this channel, I'd invite you to consider liking the video and subscribing for free. I'd much appreciate it. For Civil War Explored, my name is Benson. Take care.